Okay, and I'm curious, where's everyone joining from today? I just put it in the chat if you want to drop your location. We'd be interested to hear where you're joining us from. I think we have some friends joining from Australia. Okay, we have somebody from SoCal. Awesome, great. Where else is everyone joining from? Just curious. Okay, cool. Santa Clara, great. We're going to keep talking about where we're joining from as we wait for another minute or two while this room fills up, and then we're going to get started here, guys. So thank you for joining today. Awesome. Chicago, Northern New Jersey. I rock. Wow. Awesome. Great. We've got some global presence here. Right on. Australia. There we go. Good day, mate. Okay, great. Sorry for my poor accent, Matthew. Thanks for working with me there. Awesome. So tell us where you guys are from. Drop it in the chat. And we're going to get started here in just a minute. Love that people are joining from around the world. Okay. And then Ravi, if you want to maybe get the presentation up, and then I'll kind of talk about the group chat rules, about how this webinar is going to go, and then we're going to just briefly talk about what the Hive does, and then we're going to hear from our awesome panelists. We have such a great conversation happening today. Okay, room is still filling up a bit. Okay, great. Thanks everyone for joining. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Hive Data Think Tank webinar series. Thank you for joining us from around the world. We've got an awesome panel lined up for you guys today. We are going to be discussing driving affordability in healthcare with data and AI, which is part one of a three-part series that we're proud to present with Darling Ventures. Thank you, Darling Ventures, for doing this series with us. My name is Maddie Watt, and I am the Senior Manager of People and Programs at the Hive. So real quick, I'm going to go over the ground rules for today's webinar, and then I'm going to explain what the Hive Think Tank does before I pass the virtual mic over to TM Ravi, the Hive's founder and managing director. So chat rules. We love questions, so please use the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen to ask our presenters questions. Please refrain from putting your questions in the chat. It's easier if we put it in the Q&A section, so that way our panelists can see them all in one place, and also you guys can upvote questions there. So if you see a question that you want answered, upvote it and make sure it gets to the top of the list. Please be respectful in the chat as well, and refrain from product plugs. This is not the time or the place to recruit for your startup or for money, so we really appreciate you understanding that and working with us. This session is going to be recorded, and it will be available to view on our YouTube channel. I will make sure to drop the link in the chat so you guys have access to that. And it's also going to be emailed out tomorrow, so everyone's going to get it. We would love if you followed along on social media. And if you do that, please use the hashtag HiveData or tag us at HiveData. We love to see what's happening on social media. We love when you guys take pictures of us when we're talking and from all weird angles and put it on the web. So go on, let's see what you got. And then finally, we're gonna have a brief event survey that I'm gonna post in the chat as well. It takes just 1 second to fill out. If you don't mind doing it, it's great because it lets us tailor our events to what you guys want. So we love getting your feedback. All right, so let me just tell you real quick what the Hive Think Tank does, and then we're gonna get this thing started. The Hive Think Tank is an ecosystem of entrepreneurs, corporations, and thought leaders. We are bringing you virtual events pretty much every week now. We post our events on Meetup, and we have a blog on Medium. So I will drop both of those in the chat so that way you guys can follow along and stay up to date on everything we're doing. We're doing all things with AI and all sorts of advanced technologies. Next slide, Robbie. Thank you. And a special thanks to our sponsors. Sponsors are listed here. Also, if you want to become a sponsor, or if you want to work with us on a webinar, we would love to collaborate. Just shoot me an email. My email is there on screen, and I will drop it in the chat as well. We love working with new people, so please go ahead and reach out. All right, and so upcoming events. We are going to do another health-related event on Wednesday, August 26th at 11 a.m. Pacific. And this is going to be with Nikhil He's the CEO of GenPath Diagnostics, and we're going to talk all about the CDC and FDA guidelines and how that impacts COVID testing, what's happening with vaccines, even the difference between India and the US. And we just got off a call with him today. He's got some really exciting, cool stuff to share with you guys. So you definitely want to sign up for this. And I'm going to post the registration link for that in the chat. Next slide.
And many of you probably read Bill Gates' comments that virtually all the tests in the US are useless. So you'll kind of hear a discussion of why Bill Gates said that and why that's not the case in some other countries.
But we're not going to tell you now. You have to sign on and watch the thing to find out. Great. And then also we've got a really interesting panel on the new luxury sustainable fashion with data-powered platforms. So one of the Hive's advisors is Odile, and she is the founder of Fab Co-Creation Studio, and she is kind of helping revolutionize beauty and luxury and fashion. And she's now based in Southern California, but she was our friend and neighbor up here in the Bay Area for some time. And she's kind of helped us bring together this awesome panel on all these different startups and larger companies that are using data and AI to power their luxury and fashion platforms. Right?
And Odile used to be president of Lancôme in the past.
This is true. This is true. So without further ado, TM Ravi, please take it away.
Thank you, Maddie. So just a brief introduction of the Hive. The Hive is a venture capital group, and it's a particular kind of venture capital that is called a venture studio. So the main difference is that we have a whole operating team that works with entrepreneurs, collaborates with the entrepreneurs to help them kind of grow the companies. And the focus of the Hive is on AI-driven enterprise transformation. And so a lot of focus on leveraging data-related techniques to really drive a new generation of applications and use cases. So you'll see kind of here reflected here our thematic focus and some of the different verticals that we play in. So one of those verticals is life sciences and healthcare. And so today we are very pleased to partner with Darling Ventures, and in particular Daniel Darling and Pascal Unger, who are on this meeting call. And a special welcome to all our Australian friends who are waking up at 7 a.m. to join this event. And so the moderator of the event today is Kaushik Bhaumik. This is a three-part series. The first one today is around affordability in healthcare. The second, which is coming in a few weeks, which we'll announce, is around preventative healthcare. And the third one is going to be around personalization. And so Kaushik is the CEO of Glide Health, a Hive and Darling Ventures portfolio company. And in the past, Kaushik was the GM of Cognizant's Trizetto healthcare practice. And so with that, let me introduce Kaushik Bhaumik.
Ravi, and pleasure to be with everyone today. Let me quickly introduce my panelists. With me, two both good friends and colleagues. First is Larry Bridge. Larry is a principal at Bridge Health Partners. They provide advisory services to private equity companies in the space of healthcare. Larry has over 30 years of experience in healthcare. He has been the president of a health plan. He has worked with leading technology companies such as Trizetto and Cognizant. And he and I spent several years together at Cognizant, taking that practice to over a $3 billion healthcare entity. Yeah.
There's a bit of audio feedback that's happening. There you go.
Better?
It's happening still.
Gosh. Is this better?
Better, much better. Okay, yeah, great.
So let me just quickly redo that. So Larry Bridge is a principal at Bridge Health Partners, has 30 years experience in the healthcare sector and running plans, been on provider side as well as on the technology side. So welcome, Larry. Also with us today is Patrick Spallettini. Patrick is Vice President and Senior Partner with IBM Watson Health Consulting. He has over 27 years of experience, of consulting experience on both the payer and the provider side. Working on digital transformation, change management, and large-scale program management. And he'll be able to provide some insights as to what's going on with IBM Watson Health, a very key player in AI for healthcare. So welcome to both, and we're delighted to have everyone join us on this very informative topic. So to kind of get us going, I thought it would be helpful to have some context setting here. The US healthcare industry is one of the largest industries in the US GDP, about $3.5 trillion. That amounts to over $10,000 of healthcare spending per every person in the United States. Now that is the highest amount of spending in healthcare across all developed nations in the world. But despite that high level of spending, Americans enjoy an average life expectancy below that of their peers in other developed nations. They have higher degrees of affliction, of heart disease, and so forth. So it's a terrible irony that we spend so much for our healthcare, but we get outcomes not better than most other countries. And in particular, this past year, we've seen with COVID, Americans have had the highest incidence of COVID infections and deaths in the world. So it is a very difficult topic, a very tragic topic, but at the same time, that one that must be tackled. So perhaps we could start this conversation, and I'm going to pose this first question to you, Larry. This is a very complex industry and ecosystem, but how did we kind of arrive at this situation, right, where we're spending so much for healthcare, but not really getting what we should be getting? So.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and you can point to a lot of things, but when I've talked to audiences about this before, I've really focused down, I think, on two root causes that really got us to where we are in U.S. healthcare. One is that the healthcare system here in the U.S. evolved. It was never engineered. And then the second part of that is the components within healthcare are comprised of all these kind of individual private market companies. Okay, so if you kind of back up. And as I've talked about this before, start with this first one, the system being, evolved, never being engineered. If you picture a large rock wall, right, made up with rocks of all these different sizes and some big ones, some little ones, all these rough edges, and a lot of mortar in between trying to hold it together, right, just kind of this crazy spread out rock wall, and compare that with a finely engineered brick wall that's laid out nice and straight, the mortar joints are straight, everything works and lines together. The U.S. healthcare system, unfortunately, is most like the former rather than the latter, right? You've got this system comprised of all these private components, all doing what they do fairly well. I mean, there's a lot of good care and a lot of good innovation and everything taking place in U.S. healthcare, but being based in the private market, kind of item number two here, they all have different incentives and different objectives, and often those incentives and objectives are in conflict. Right, and the most common example people talk about is the payer versus the provider, and that's true. A lot of places they conflict, but you can actually drill down much finer than that, right? If you think about the inpatient hospital and the ambulatory surgery center, or the surgeon versus the physical therapist, right? When each of those components are all running their own individual business, they're trying to maximize what they do, and often those things come in conflict. And so I think that combination, it leads to things like fraud, waste, and abuse, right? It leaves the system open for some of those challenges. And fraud, waste, and abuse is estimated in the US to be up to 25% of that $3.5 trillion spend when you take all three of those components together. Overtreatment and undertreatment, another key challenge that we face. If you look at places like Miami in Florida, Florida, where you've got a plethora of heart hospitals and cardiac care all over the place, you'll find treatment rates, even when normalized for underlying morbidity, at 2.5 times for cardiac care than you find on the national average. And the ugly twin of overtreatment is undertreatment, right? There's other places in the US where the incentives aren't as good. And you find people who actually need care not getting care when they should. So the condition gets worse. It almost always gets more expensive, and the clinical outcome is bad, right? So those are just two examples: overtreatment, undertreatment, fraud, waste, and abuse that drive a lot of the cost. But I think they all come back to those two root causes of lack of an engineered system and all these healthcare component pieces, if you will, based in the private market with their own individual incentives, often conflicting with each other.
That's a great viewpoint, Larry. And obviously, a lot of politicians and the administration are trying to look at how to better engineer the system. But there's a lot of good activity going on as it relates to trying to better make each of these different stones and work better and address the fraud, waste, and abuse and undertreatment and overtreatment. And one of those areas is the application of technology. And in particular, what we want to talk about today is AI, right? With the advances in AI, can we better get at fraud, waste, and abuse? Can we get at proper treatment for diagnosis? And so to that end, Patrick, how has AI really come to the fore here in healthcare around those areas of fraud, waste, and abuse and proper treatment? And how are you all looking at that?
Yeah, I think, first thing to remember is AI is not like the Steven Spielberg movie, right? It's not robots replacing humans. It's big data and complex algorithms being put together in a way to help, humans and clinicians in particular make more informed decisions, more intelligent decisions. And so I think a lot has changed in the last 15 years to make AI much more applicable in the healthcare space. I mean, if you take the big data part of it, right? 15 years ago, there weren't a lot of big data sets. There certainly weren't a lot of commercially available or even publicly available data sets. And so fast forward to today, you've got in the United States, we've got a lot of commercial vendors that sell data. So any provider, any payer can get access to comparable data, like just, some examples, the Blue Health Intelligence database. It's all the Blues data minus the Anthem Health plan. United has the Optum database. Truven Analytics is a big database, which is, a vendor that we own. Even free data. You can get free data from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, MedPAR data, which is Medicare data, the Medicare limited data set. All of these data sets are available now that weren't available 10, 15 years ago. The other thing that's happened is if you think about the industry in the United States, there's been a lot of consolidation and convergence within the industry. So again, fast forward today, you've got big organizations like CommonSpirit and Ascension and all these large hospital systems where now they've got all this data within their own four walls that they didn't have a decade ago. So they've got a lot more data that they can use within the organization. And the same, by the way, can be said for payers, right? Payers have gobbled up other payers. They've bought provider organizations, et cetera. So it solves that part of the problem when you're looking at AI and any kind of analytics of the law of large numbers. If you don't have a large data set, you can't really you can't produce reliable outcomes, right? There's a lot of funny anecdotal evidence around some of the early AI that was done around, or some of the results were really funny, like taller people are more likely to repay their home loans, or the correlation between the lunar cycle and sales success. I mean, those things are just kind of nonsense, right? But now we've got these big data sets that the outcomes are much more reliable. So that's half of it. That's what's been a big change. The other half is that, and I can remember back to grad school, literally manually writing algorithms. We were taught how to do them manually, and then we graduated Excel spreadsheets. But fast forward today, we've got so much more computational power, supercomputers. We've got software programs that you can buy that you couldn't get a decade ago. And so when you match the computational power with the data that we've got, AI is much more applicable today, and we can apply it against more things that we want to study. Some of the limitations, however, have been that humans are much better at taking in little nuances, like nuances in language and facial recognition, and looking at someone you're talking to them and maybe being able to see that they're communicating something that they're not orally, right? So AI still has a way to go to help solve some of these issues. But we've got, inventions like natural language processing and machine learning that are, allowing us to be able to figure out some of those little nuances in content, even photos and stuff like that. So we're getting better. But lots of applications clinically. We're doing a really good job. At IBM, we've done a lot of work with IBM Watson around oncology, for example, and helping clinicians make more informed decisions around clinical pathways and protocols for patients, depending upon what they present with when they go to the clinician or their historical claims data, their family history. We're taking all that information in. We're being able to help clinicians make better decisions. Lots of applications for it, I think, in the administrative space. Payers have been using AI for a long time around claims adjudication. Providers are starting to use it now, I think, in the back office and for things like prior auth and denial analytics. So it's come a long way, relative to, let's say, a decade ago.
No, it has, and you started framing it up in a nice framework to think about it in terms of the impact it's having on cost of care, and then the cost of administration of healthcare. And then three of us have talked about the topic a lot. That in the U.S., for every healthcare dollar, roughly 85 cents is going towards the cost of care. The drugs, the services, and so forth, the labs, and 15 cents is going towards the cost of administration. And we've seen AI applied to both. But I'd love to dive a little deeper on both of those. Maybe Larry, on the cost of administration side of things, where has the state of the art been? Where are things going? And where do we think over the next 3 to 5 years things might further go as it relates to cost of administration?
Yeah, I think to Patrick's point, it really has come out well, particularly on the payer side and administration, where the incentives here for the payers has always been, how do I reduce cost? And so many of the AI and ML solutions today are focused on that. So things to address complex claims, things to make what were previously very cumbersome manual processes efficient or automated, seems to be the area of focus. I think more recently, you've seen it doing the things that cause friction between payer and providers. AI-enabled prior authorizations, I think, are a great example. One of the banes of the industry, providers hate them, payers don't have any fun with it either, but it's an entrenched part of the system today to try and control the cost of care. Well, now that's moving to a fully automated process where, with the data that comes in and being able to apply artificial intelligence and the algorithms to it, you can automate that process of doing the authorizations for care. So I think that's one of the exciting areas where you're seeing the administrative area move over those things that really do help payers and providers work together. You've got innovative companies out there, some large ones like Optum, small ones, a company called Hindsight that's using AI to really address fraud, waste, and abuse. And I think it comes back to what Patrick was talking about. It used to be you had people in a room working with some algorithms and limited sets of data. Well, now we're getting these massive sets of data, which is great, but you couldn't hire enough people to sift through them and come up with the conclusions you need if you didn't have that AI-enabled tool to help you do it. And I think that's what we're starting to see. So fraud, waste, and abuse, payment integrity on the payer side, looking through claims and making sure that they're truly billing for and the providers being reimbursed for from a clinical practice perspective and everything else, what they should. And then, Koshik, you've got a front seat to this, revenue integrity on the provider side, where the provider can look back and say, well, wait a sec, I want to make sure that I'm being paid appropriately for what I did, the diagnosis, the contract I have in place, and everything that goes with it. You're seeing a lot of that come in on the administrative side to make those processes more efficient, and I think kind of a better outcome for everybody involved, but digesting the large data sets that Patrick referred to in a way that's very beneficial.
That's right. Thanks for introducing, Glide Health, where we're focusing on that whole revenue integrity for the providers and applying AI. And you're right, it stems upon having access to a large data set and being able to make those observations. And we've built our business on several large data sets to do that. Patrick, looking at the cost of care side of things, I'm sure this is an area that you all have looked at Watson. There's the drugs, right? There's the services, and definitely a lot of the overheads. And, there's a lot been done on the drugs and applying AI to more efficient drug discovery and development and so forth. But can you expound on maybe a little on that and then the other parts of the cost of care as you all have seen it?
Yeah, certainly our life sciences brethren are spending a lot of time using AI to do more effective clinical trials, right? And coming up with drug regimens, and in many ways using AI to kind of speed up the clinical trial process, which can be long and arduous and drawn out. And then on the care delivery side, again, it's been going on probably longer, but it's really being used to come up with better diagnostics and more targeted therapies. And another thing that's sort of pushing, especially on the provider side, more emphasis on AI and better decision making is In the United States, we've got this revolution towards value-based care and being paid on a value-based, reimbursement basis, where, one of the big cost drivers in the United States is that historically we've been paid on a fee-for-service basis, where I get paid for productivity. The more you pay me, the more I make. And so that creates some perverse incentives. Value-based care, which is really, we had this in the 90s, but it's come back again because of the Affordable Care Act, initially being driven by government, but now being driven also by commercial payers, is forcing providers to spend more time being more effective and more efficient in delivery of care. AI is a great way to help them through that process, using all that data to figure out what's the best way for me to deliver care to that particular person at that time, giving information to a clinician in real time so they can help make decisions. And so all of that, anytime you're more efficient in the delivery of care, more effective in the delivery of care, that means you're expending less in terms of, maybe I'm using generic drugs that are just as effective as the branded ones because I did the analysis and it shows the outcomes are the same. Or maybe if it's a total knee replacement, the data tells me that for whatever reason for my population, the Stryker knee works better than the Johnson & Johnson knee, right? So all of that data is being used to drive better healthcare decision-making at the clinical delivery level. And then administratively, I'm seeing the same things like you guys are. Payment integrity, we're seeing a lot of people want to focus on using AI, especially for denial analytics and also prior auth. I think those are really big areas. And then the other thing I'd say about providers is we've got an inventory management tool, and there are some other people out in the market that are using AI to drive better decision-making in the supply chain management process. Using AI to, be able to tell the CFO or the supply chain manager that, hey, this particular supply is running low, or that particular medical device or that particular drug is running low, predicting when it's going to run low, and at the same time using AI to do strategic sourcing and figuring out, well, who's got that supply, where in the world, not just necessarily in the United States, where does that supply exist, what's the best price for that supply, and if I can get that supply in real time and get it at a low price, that's also pulling costs out of the system. So lots of places that we're seeing it applied administratively as well as clinically.
No, terrific, very rich response there, Patrick. Let's take it a little further, and this pertains to one of the questions that got asked in the Q&A there. We obviously, central to the success of AI is the availability and proper use of data, right? And financial, transactional, clinical, personal. So all of us in healthcare are very familiar with HIPAA compliance and the rules engendered there. But beyond that, what do organizations need to think about for a really successful AI? Because without the right data, it's hard to make proper decisions. So, Patrick, I'll start with you and then come back to Larry. Patrick, what have you seen as it relates to data and the management around data?
Yeah, so some of these things are structural. I'll get to those in a second. But, one thing I notice, even with some of the most sophisticated, mature clients that we work with is, if you don't have the right culture in place, if you don't adopt, either I want to be today or sometime in the future, a data-driven organization, you don't have the right culture to start with. Sometimes we even see organizations say, I want to be a data-driven organization. I want to make decisions based upon data and analysis. But then they don't do simple things like maybe they've got a major initiative of some sort, and they're not using data and metrics and key performance indicators to measure their success towards that initiative, which, by the way, contributes a lot to that famous, you probably remember this, Coach, having spent time at McKinsey, that famous study that they did that showed that 70% of all change initiatives fail. Well, if you're not measuring yourself towards that initiative, you won't get it done. So a lot of times we see organizations they're not measuring themselves. So if you can't measure yourself and you haven't bought into that, you're probably not going to do a good job at adopting AI and predictive analytics. So that's got to change, first of all. Organizations have got to be bought into being a data-driven organization. The other thing that we see, and this is particularly a challenge in the United States, I think, I'm actually seeing that some of our international clients are a little ahead of the United States in this perspective, is that you've got to be able to exchange data within your organization as well as outside the organization. So you've got to be intraoperable as well as interoperable. I mentioned all of this consolidation that happened, and there wasn't a lot of good post-merger integration, but if you can get that under control and you can share the data within your organization, that allows you to get a 360-degree view of your member if you're a plan, or of the patient if you're a provider, or if you're a plan, the 360-degree view of the provider that's in your network. So getting that under control is probably step one. And then step two, if you can be interoperable and share data, and in the United States, of course, we've got a mandate and a rule that's helping us get there, it's pushing us to get there, but you've got to be able to exchange data outside the organization too. patients go to hospitals that are, they don't always go to the same hospital. There are a lot of snowbirds, who live in New York who have houses in Florida. They go to different hospitals. If those hospitals aren't sharing data, now I'm down in Florida and I'm a physician, I got to see that patient. If I don't have access to the data in New York, I don't have a full picture of that patient. Same thing can be said around plans. I mean, I change my plan almost every year, right? If Cigna didn't have, I have Anthem now. If Anthem doesn't have access to Cigna's data, they don't have a full view of me. So you got to be intra and interoperable. And the last thing I'd say is data transparency. A lot of what we're trying to do in the United States is change physician behavior. And the way you can get physicians to change behavior, they're very competitive. If you can show them data, show them the reports, how they compare to their peers, there's a lot of evidence that shows that they'll actually change their behavior and do the right thing and adopt a better protocol. But you've also got to be transparent with that data. And that means, look, clinicians they're scientific in nature, right? They went to, if you're a physician, you probably went to at least 12 years of school in the United States, maybe longer if you're a surgeon. So they're very good at understanding data. And they want to understand, well, where did you come up with that data? What was the methodology you used to come to that analysis? So they're open to that if you can show that to them. It'll get them to be bought into the process and buy into accepting suggestions from AI, right? And then the other thing is visualizing data. If you can visualize data better so that the end user or the clinician can, understand it quickly, because there's a lot of problems with, physician burnout right now. They need things to be easy for them to understand. That'll also go a long way towards, promoting AI and predictive analytics.
Great. No, thanks, Patrick. Larry, your views on, and what you've seen organizations who do data well and those who don't, kind of, what would you contrast?
Yeah, I think, well, Patrick, you hit most of the key points right in there. And I think just to emphasize the successful organizations, I mean, this is a three-legged stool. It's a combination of AI, data, and analytics. And if you're missing any one of those three, right, you're not going to be successful in bringing these new models to market, particularly the new value-based care models that you mentioned, Patrick, and being able to sift through the data to really get those individual-centric, kind of member-specific or patient-specific treatment programs that everybody is shooting for. So I do think that part is key. And maybe just add to it a payer spin on this. It's interesting when you kind of bring in the organizational element here. I think there's been pretty good alignment in the health insurers or the payers on the administrative side of AI and bringing these things together. It's the clinical side that's probably been lagging behind, right? You're finding a lot more emphasis in the past on clinical guidelines, individual knowledge. This is what we have. And I think there's so much potential. Some of the things Patrick was talking about earlier, AI-guided diagnosis, AI-guided treatment protocols, things like that, where you can really start to get some standardization. It's the clinical side that I think has the potential to really drive a lot of value in getting better care and reducing cost. Again, those are the two key objectives. You want to do both. You don't want to just do one at the expense of the other. And so getting engagement on the clinical side, particularly in the health insurance organizations, I think is one of the next areas. And in fact, you're starting to see the larger firms address it. Chief digital officers, chief clinical information officer, you're really seeing the clinical emphasis on IT, which before was primarily related to the administrative side. So organizing around analytics, AI, and data, and protecting and integrating those sources, and then integrating it throughout the organization, at least from what I've observed, has been key to making these things successful.
Right.
Yeah, if I may, Coach,
ahead,
I would second that. I think that's totally true. I've seen AI be deployed in payers much longer than providers. And even today in the United States, the providers that are doing it, maybe a lot of them are academic medical centers. They're more of the cutting edge facilities that have adopted this, or organizations that are perhaps more sophisticated and have more disposable income. It's not as ubiquitous in the provider space. There's a lot more upside in the provider space, I think, than there is in the payer space. I agree with that.
If I can just pick up on a point there too, I think coming back to this conversation and earlier, Patrick, when you introduced the concept of value-based care, we'll sit here and we'll talk about the payer and provider all day. The whole concept of value-based care is to create these new reimbursement models where the payer, the provider, and the patient all work in this aligned fashion, right? And a lot of the emphasis you see is on the payer and provider, which is great. But something we probably don't talk enough about, Koshik, is the role of the patient, right? And this is, I don't know if this is unique to the US or not, but we seem to be showing it today, right? It is amazing how much Americans don't want to engage in their healthcare, right? Until it becomes something serious, right? If you can tell people, wow, you're 12 months away from a really bad outcome or something like that, kind of like I'll worry about it in 12 months. Now, if I'm sick, I'm really sick, I'm going to go get treatment. But we have shown time and time again, and there's so many failed apps and failed programs out there that are trying to get people to engage around their healthcare that they just don't do. And I think this is another area in solving this problem that AI really has a role to play. If I get a letter from my health plan that says, "Hey Larry, you should eat better and exercise more," advice, but I'm not going to do a lot with that. On the other hand, if I've got an AI-enabled app on my phone, and between my smartwatch and my smart clothing, which a lot of companies are working on now, it's monitoring changes in my body. The algorithms are looking at that. And I get a personalized alert that says, Larry, you've lost 10 pounds. We're seeing these changes in patterns from your skin and your heart rate. You ought to go get checked for X. That is a way to, using a term from the past, mass customization, right? You're using AI to enable the masses for hopefully a more personalized way to get the patient to engage. And I just want to bring that up because we can talk payer and provider all day, but until we get, particularly here in the US, individuals to take a more active role in their care before they're sick, a year before they have that catastrophic event, we're only going to have limited success. And to me, that's one of the most exciting areas where I think AI can help, getting that patient engagement.
Very good point, Larry. The whole area of preventative medicine and utilizing tools and technologies that the tech companies are trying to put out there so that people are more daily engaged in their health, so that you don't have that visit to the doctor when you need to. You've tried to address problems ahead of time. Patrick, you going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say, Larry, you bring up a great point, and it made me think about that. We're currently engaged with a few. This is an interesting use case, right? Kaushik, you and Larry and I always talk about use cases, right? Where we're working with a few US-based grocery chains that want to work with payers, by the way, grocery chains and a very large and prominent medical device company, not necessarily a medical device company, but a device company that has wearables and smartphones and that kind of thing. And we're working together to come up with a strategy and an underlying platform that would support when consumers are walking through a grocery store and maybe they walk by a certain aisle with healthy food in it, that they get prompted to choose the healthy selection over, Cheetos or whatever, And that also has really interesting ramifications in terms of consumers, right? You're right. Consumers got to be a part of this in the United States, right? When we talk about population health, it's another term, US-based term, we're trying to push care into the population, getting them to make better decisions before they actually have to hit the emergency room or get tertiary care, which are the two most expensive ways to get care in the United States. And one interesting way that we're working on that is, can we get a device manufacturer with a grocery store chain and then using underlying analytics and AI to get them to make more healthy decisions when they're sitting there and in real time in the grocery store, make them buy the right things. And there's a way to measure that too, right? All that underlying data, we can look back and say, was that successful, right? And we can adjust the program if not. But yeah, lots of interesting things going around getting the consumers to make the right decisions. But man, that is really, and I also wonder, like you, Larry, is that unique to the United States? Because it really is a challenge here. People don't want to be told what to do until they're literally on their deathbed.
Tough statement, but true. Let's bring the current events into perspective here. Obviously, with the COVID pandemic, a lot of heightened attention, but appropriately so, on healthcare, the health system. People are realizing its shortcomings. AI could play a very significant role with things like contact tracing and things along those lines. Provide your perspectives on what the COVID pandemic has done, both positively and negatively, as it relates to healthcare, and how some of the adoption of some of these AI technologies and other technologies will accelerate as a result. So, Patrick, maybe start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the things that we saw happen with AI as it relates to the pandemic itself, and I guess epidemiologically, there's a Canadian company called Blue Dot, for example. I just read this recently, that they, through AI, discovered patterns in pneumonia care in China like a week before, maybe 2 weeks before the WHO said that there was a new coronavirus. And so I thought that was very interesting. Of course, the government of South Korea used AI and is using AI to inform citizens via their smartphones and other such devices, other digital devices, when they're near an area where there's been a breakout, right? So AI helps them avoid those locations and therefore the spread. And then, I think other sort of, long-term impacts, medium and long-term impacts of the pandemic and how it relates to AI. I mean, I think a lot of press about this, that, IBM Watson helped, in the vaccine process and running through some of the scenarios prior to the vaccine. There's a lot of applications there. But virtual care, I think the stat is that something like, I think most physicians or providers saw a 60+% increase in virtual care visits, either remote patient monitoring or telehealth or telemedicine. And there's certainly, I don't think that's going to be the future state, that all 60% of all visits and encounters are going to be a virtual care, but it's certainly going to be much higher than it was prior to COVID. And so AI is going to have to, and I guess let me couple that with, there was already a movement pre-COVID to pushing care more in the community, right? Machinations like CVS, Aetna, where, they're trying to get more use of those clinics, Walmart's clinics, Walgreens clinics, substance abuse providers that are typically in the community. Even in the United States, we've got companies like Dose Healthcare here in Nashville, where it's kind of like Uber for healthcare. You've got an application. I feel sick. I don't want to go someplace. I want to have somebody come to my house. And so using this app, I pull it up. I can see who the closest nurse practitioner is, and they come to my house, right? All of that care is getting pushed more and more in the community, because in the United States, we're trying to catch things before they get to the emergency room and tertiary care. And AI is going to play a huge role in that. So AI has got to we've got to figure out as part of the AI process, how do we collect that data? How do we provide intelligent decision-making assistance to care providers that are in the community at those clinics, substance abuse providers that are, in clinics in the field and in urban areas, for example, or, in the United States, we've got big opioid crisis in rural areas. And so those substance abuse providers are out in the community providing care. How do we get them intelligent decision-making in their hands while they're delivering that care? So I think there are lots of applications that are going to, novel applications of AI that are going to happen because of the pandemic.
Larry, your thoughts on what the pandemic has done in terms of accelerating the trends and adoption?
Yeah, no, I think Patrick's right. I mean, there's a lot of individual cases out there, and I think if you look at all these, the things Patrick mentioned, Patrick, earlier you mentioned using AI to speed up clinical trials. The National Institutes of Health is using AI as, we get to a point where we're getting some expected treatments and hopefully some expected vaccines, knock on wood, for the COVID-19, using AI to figure out what set of treatments and what set of vaccines works better for certain groups of population, right? You're finding a lot, at least what I've seen, you're finding a lot of case by case by case examples where AI is being used to accelerate the outcome. And I think that's the real promise of all this right here. It's not that AI is going to solve any one thing, or there is an AI-enabled solution that's going to solve COVID-19. But if you look at the myriad of things that are going on out there to tackle this issue, AI seems to be making a lot of them bigger, faster, quicker, getting to results. And I think that's probably going to be the real benefit that comes out of this. We're seeing it in action, driving a better result sooner, which in a situation like this is, I think, everything you could ask for, right? It's exactly what we want to have happen. And I think underlying a lot of these things is AI-driven technology.
Well, let me take several of the questions that have been posed in the Q&A. One that I think is quite prominent is this whole notion of patient privacy and their data and the control around that data as it is applied for different AI uses. And I think this also gets towards, the patient responsibility in their own healthcare. So Larry, how should we be thinking about privacy and data and the controls around it? How control is, given to other participants in the chain? How do we make that work in a seamless way, given all the complexities of the system?
Yeah, it is going to be hard. We're dealing with it today, right? So the HIPAA rules have been in place and everything for a number of years. And I think we've got to walk that balance between, if you're going to get the patient better care, a better outcome, you're going to have more complete data, right? So when you engage with that patient, whether it's the doctor's office, whether it's through their insurance plan or whatever, following through with that collection of data that exists today, right? You can share your administrative data, your clinical data for the benefit of your health, is going to naturally extend to, by the way, we're going to have other sources of data, perhaps, that need to come together: behavioral data, preference data, choices, the way the patient likes to engage, social determinants of health. There's so many more things that you can use to build that robust picture of the individual. They're going to have to come into play. So I think we got to make sure that we're using existing protocols, using existing security as we build that larger data set. I think the other side of this, and Patrick, I know IBM's done a great job with this through Truven and a lot of the other things they've acquired, but there's these huge data sets that I think very effectively been able to blind, right? Been able to use the broad data that's out there, make sure that you don't have any individual specific or individual identifiable data that's there, and get the value that comes out of the law of large numbers. That to me is just as important, because for this to all come together, you've got to have that broader set of individual data, then you've got to have the reference set, that broader data set that's out there. And I think we have processes that are in place for both. We just have to make sure we're sticking with them and can execute and protect that data as we move forward.
Yeah, I would agree with everything Larry said. And it's funny, so you're talking about internal controls, right? How we put these in internal controls around protecting data, one of which is to de-identify it, and then you can kind of avoid the whole question, right? It's funny though, you know, a lot of the press around breaches are around hacking. And I don't know the stats, but it seems like there's just as much physical, misprotection of data than there is, electronic and hacking instances of data, right? It seems like there are more instances of people taking home data to their house and then sending it via email or something than there is somebody actually broke in and penetrated far enough to get access to healthcare data. So a lot of this is just about very basic internal controls, things like, locked doors and, biometric devices to get beyond certain parts of the building so that people can't get access to, data that they shouldn't have. But I agree with Larry, it's a very hard thing to do because, again, back to this patchwork system that we have in the United States where everybody does everything differently. There isn't some uniform way of doing things. And so some people are spending more time and effort around it than others. Privacy in the United States often is looked at as a compliance thing rather than a good business. And so, especially again on the provider side where the margins are even lower and they don't have a lot of extra cash, it's kind of hard sometimes to convince them to spend money on doing things like basic internal controls and security controls for data electronically as well as, access to it manually. Now, first time that they have a breach, somehow either manually or electronically, and if they pay a big fine, of course they start to pay attention, or if their neighbor across the street starts to have that problem. So a lot of times what we have to do is convince clients that there's a business imperative, that there's a return on investment somehow to do that, other than not having to pay fines, right? When you go in and look at internal controls around, a patient or a member or a provider data, invariably you're going to find some weaknesses and some need for additional technology and things that are going to improve the overall business and make it more efficient anyway. So sometimes it's the conversation that we have to massage with the client to get them to understand it's more than just a compliance thing. There's actually really a benefit to your business in doing this. But it is very much a challenge here, and we're still grappling with it. And I think we've got a ways to go before we're going to get it under control.
One very interesting question that's being asked is the impact of AI on the ER and urgent care. And the ER and urgent care are big cost drivers, right? Tying it back to the theme of this conversation around the cost of affordability of healthcare. Anybody who's ever been to an ER knows the whopping bill you may often get from the ER. So thoughts on that in terms of what can be done to bring down ER urgent care costs through AI and other technologies? Either one, whoever wants to take it on.
I can take it, or Larry. Okay,
So, go ahead.
So one is if we're using AI to choose better pathways, hopefully we're going to have better outcomes, which means less chance of readmission, and oftentimes that readmission is through the ER. So if you look at it one way, that's one way that AI can help avoid costs associated with the ER. The other thing, and we talked about this earlier, is that if we can use AI to assist delivering care in the community before, at somebody's home engaging them sooner before they, smoking cessation programs, get people to stop smoking so that they don't necessarily then have all the downstream negative, healthcare issues you can have with that. But if we can use AI to promote community care delivery, the idea then behind that would be, okay, well, then we should avoid the ER. We should have less ER visits. We should have less tertiary care costs. So there's a couple of things that I know that we're working on.
Yeah, no, I would just echo that. I think the biggest potential, because when you look at emergency room in particular and usage, so much of that comes back to the patient. It's kind of like, well, I'm at this point, I don't know what to do, so I'll just go to the emergency room, and then what happens, happens. And I think there's so much around patient guidance, patient information, earlier patient engagement, helping people understand the way that maybe they can more simply navigate the system, get the care they need, or, as Patrick said, intervene sooner so that you have a chance to get that patient before they end up taking the most costly route to the cost of care. From my perspective, that's where you're going to get the most bang out of this. I continue to believe that one of the biggest benefits of AI, if we're sitting here in 5 years and looking back and say, where did AI really help us make the greatest, progress in addressing the cost of care? I'm hopeful, and I believe it's going to be around the engagement of the patient.
And it's one I think all three of us may have perspective on is, Larry, you had painted the picture of why we're such a complex and costly system as a sort of a stone wall with everybody up on. Now, you also have a similar thing happening in the AI community with lots of different startups, right? We're at Glide Health, we're a startup focusing on AI and applying it on the rev cycle. There are lots of dozens and dozens of other companies in AI. And so will it further proliferate that model by having all these different companies, focusing on different facets of the healthcare problem? Or do we think there's a dynamic that'll evolve over time so that people are working in concert to solve the bigger problems of the day? So your thoughts on that?
I think it's a good question because, if you look at everything around healthcare, we are such a entrepreneurial healthcare environment where anybody with a good idea says, all right, let's take this and let's try and figure out if I can make a difference, right? And if there's a place where you got a shot as an individual company at jumping into the fray and at least getting to take a swing at the ball, so to speak, it's healthcare. And AIs could be an example of that. What I think might be a little bit different, though, is AI, if you listen to all the conversations about it, it's not about bringing something new to the market as much as it is correcting what's not working well, right? Let's use this to address this problem. Let's get a better clinical outcome. Let's get a lower cost outcome. Let's do this more quickly, more efficiently. I'm hopeful. I believe this is one of those technologies, and there's others that are going to take the challenges of today and make them somewhat better, as opposed to create all new components, right, that aren't connected to the rest of the stuff. I think we've got a better shot with this in helping problems that exist rather than, creating new fragmentation, so to speak.
Patrick, any additional words on that?
Yeah, well, I am of Italian descent, so I'll put my Machiavellian, VC PE hat on, and if it's like any other industry, I think probably what'll happen over time is you'll see lots of roll-ups, right? So some, IBM Watson's a good example of that. We've bought a number of companies that are in the AI space, and we chose them for strategic reasons, and we're building a portfolio of capabilities. And I think you'll see other big companies do that too. You'll also see some companies that are just will be super successful on their own and become a big company in and of themselves. And so I think over time, if you look at the way markets typically grow, we're probably going to get more and more of that capability in a smaller number of companies, right? And so, which is effective in a certain sense, because if I'm a big organization and if I can engage, one organization to do as much of this as possible, that's probably a better, outcome for me. I mean, having to deal with lots of different vendors is difficult. But that kind of pattern you see a lot in all kinds of industries, right? So if there's a consolidation, at what pace that happens, I don't know, but I think that might solve a lot of that. And then it becomes less of, having to deal with this company for that part of AI need. I need AI for benefits management over here and AI for revenue cycle over here. At some point, all of those are going to converge either through a series of partnerships or because they're all underneath one umbrella. That's what I would think.
Okay, last question I'd like to pose, and it relates to the original topic around affordability of healthcare. We're seeing, the unbundling of the hospital and decentralization of care, more home-based care, and those are positive things, right? We want to have cost of care brought down, and one of the ways you do that is by, decentralizing care to more remote medicine and so forth. But what role will AI and data play in that remote patient monitoring and so forth? Obviously pushing it out to the patients is good, but data and AI will have a very key role in making that truly effective. So you guys want to comment on that?
Patrick, go.
Yeah, I can hit that. So, I think it's back to what I said earlier, which is giving data, giving intelligent decision-making process through the assistance of AI to clinicians in the field. I think that's ultimately where we're going. So if I'm in the field, or maybe I'm a nurse, a home health nurse, and I'm seeing a patient remotely via video conference or a telehealth or telemedicine device. In today's world, the way that most of that happens is it's just a one-on-one conversation. There's not really AI aiding the clinician and helping make the next decision. So I see a lot of movement we might go in that direction. One of the things that we're doing is we think there's such a market for expanding the amount of virtual care that is delivered across different types of clinical needs, that there could even be sort of this command center that, especially if you're a big organization, like let's take Vanderbilt here in Nashville where I live. Vanderbilt's 15 different organizations. There's several hospitals, there's a children's hospital, there's a main hospital, there's home care, there's a big physician organization. Not all of those organizations are very well connected. They don't all really know what's going on. All of them are doing a little bit of virtual care, and I suspect in the future state they'll be doing more of it. And so when you work with an organization that large, you might need like a command center, literally like a NASA command center, where you're coordinating all that information in one location, and then through all that collected data and the application of AI, be able to shoot out recommendations across the entire enterprise, right? So I think it's about pushing decision-making, intelligent decision-making, AI-aided decision-making into the clinicians' hands, especially those that are going to be delivering care in the community.
Yeah. The only thing I'd add on to that, and I think those are all good points, and I'll go back to the patient again. There's so many times post-discharge, so post-acute care, or any type of follow-up, when you decentralize care, the ability to have AI it's never going to replace, I don't believe it's going to replace the human connection, between the patient and the provider at the very end. But the ability of AI to monitor patients, right? Monitor the discharge, monitor the vitals, monitor what's going on, having the patient check in and understand those results and create intervention when it's necessary. I mean, so much of what happens today is you get somebody 70 years old discharged into a home. They don't have anybody to care for them. They didn't understand their discharge instructions. They're not going to hear from a nurse for a week. Well, if you compare from that's somebody that has the right monitors in place, somebody that's getting an automated check-in or automated registering of vitals, that can go back and create that earlier intervention, to where if somebody's going off in the wrong direction, you can start to take action earlier. I mean, I think it's going to go hand in hand with making that decentralized care both possible and more effective, and is, again, going to be one of the key roles that AI plays as we see this new decentralized, or this more decentralized healthcare model roll out.
And I think to that end, we all saw the announcement of the Teladoc Livongo merger last week, and I would hazard a guess that AI and data and all that data that they will have collectively was perhaps one of the prime motivators for that deal. So I think it speaks to the points the two of you were just making. Well, terrific. Well, thank you, Patrick of IBM, and thank you, Larry Bridge of Bridge Partners. A very rich and hearty discussion around the use of AI to control the cost of care and improve the quality of care in the United States. So thank you both for a very timely and rich conversation. So with that, I'll hand it back to Maddie and Robbie.
Thank you guys so much for this amazing conversation. I know I learned so much, and I hope our audience did too. It was fantastic. Just to remind everyone that this session was recorded and it is going to be available on our YouTube channel. I'm going to drop that again in the chat, and that's going to be emailed out to everyone who registered for this webinar today. And lastly, if you have just 1 or 2 minutes, please fill out our brief event back survey so we can design events specifically tailored to your needs. And we hope to see you on our future events. Make sure that you sign up for the Hive Think Tank with our meetup page, because that way you can find out when we are dropping the next part of this series, and that will be coming out soon. So make sure that you register with the Hive Think Tank. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you, Kaushik, Larry, Patrick, and of course, Maddie, for making this all happen.